Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting lecture in cognitive psychology. We are approaching the halfway point in our semester, in our course. We are almost over the major hump or the biggest hill here that we have in class. So we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel very, very soon here for the completion of the course. So today we are going to be talking about a very important issue associated with memory and memory processes, which is this idea of metacognition, or what we also call metamemory. And I'm also going to be talking today about the ideas associated with how to enhance your memory performance, because many times we come across this issue of, well, all right, I have information stored in my long-term memory, but how do I improve my ability, number one, to retrieve that information, or how do I also improve my ability to be able to take information out of long-term memory and also putting information in long-term memory? So how do we actually study better for an exam and putting information in and then making sure that we're able to retrieve that information later on? So first, let's begin with this idea of metamemory and what is this idea of metamemory. I really do think that this little graphic here that I have for you at the beginning of the lecture really just capture the whole idea of metamemory and what it's all about. Because if you notice the way that this caricature is kind of painted out for you, or the way it's illustrated, is that we have this individual thinking about the individual thinking about themselves. So in other words, that's really what this whole idea of metacognition or metamemory is. It's thinking about your own ability in terms of cognition or in terms of memory. So thinking about your own memory ability is really what we're referring to here in terms of memory, in terms of metamemory. So what is a general definition associated with metamemory? It's really just an awareness of one's own memory and one's own memory ability as well. And this is always a very important aspect associated with this idea of memory and memory processes, because we have to really first begin with this idea of, do I even know if I have this content stored somewhere in my long-term memory? And one of the things that we would assume to ourselves is, well, if you're thinking to yourself related to that specific issue of, do I have this content stored? You're questioning yourself, number one. So in other words, you may potentially be doubting yourself, and if you doubt yourself, you may potentially not have the information there, or you may actually put up barriers to being able to retrieve that information because you already doubt that you have the information present, number one. Or the other issue would be that we actually do have the information in our long-term memory processes or within our memory store, and what we now need to do is be aware that that information is there, and how do we actually retrieve that information. Now, the idea of having this own awareness of your own memory ability is very, very important for having effective encoding and then later retrieval. Because then again, if we are aware of our own memory and our own memory ability, it's going to help us to be able to encode information more effectively and also be able to retrieve that information in an effective fashion. Because if I'm cognizant of my own memory and also my own memory ability, I need to be able to then formulate some type of strategy or try to make sure that I make those deeper level connections that we talked about in terms of deeper processing, so that way the information seems to make sense and I encode it more properly. And that's ultimately going to then lead to easier retrieval, because if I'm also aware that I have the information in my long-term memory bank and I need to be able to pull that information out, if I did a good job at encoding, so being aware of my own memory abilities in terms of the encoding stage, and if I encoded the information properly, I would then hope that I would be able to retrieve that information effectively as well. So what are we really referring to here in terms of these aspects of metamemory? We're really referring to these ideas of the content that we actually have and also how to actually recall information, which are very, very important to us in terms of the memory processes that we deal with on a daily basis. Now, one very important issue here that we have to consider associated with this idea of knowing about your own memory content and also how to actually remember information. So this idea that we are actually working with the notion that I am an effective encoder, I'm going to be able to store information appropriately in my memory bank, is we have to visit the idea of confidence. And the idea of confidence and a belief in your ability in terms of being able to store information and also to be able to retrieve information is ultimately going to affect performance. Now, there's lots and lots of memory myths that are out there. At the beginning of the semester, remember that I gave you all a survey associated with very specific questions that I said, what do you think about cognitive psychology? And on there, I asked specific questions associated with this idea of confidence. So there was a question on there that said, if I'm very confident of my own abilities, I should then be able to remember the information. And those are going to be some of the things that we're going to talk about in today's lecture, because we do actually see that there is some aspect of a relationship between confidence and your ability to recall, but it may not necessarily be what you think it's going to be. So when we think of meta-memory and we think about the effects that meta-memory has on our memory performance, lots of research has actually been done on this idea associated with meta-memory, or the belief associated with your ability to be able to retrieve information. And a very interesting study by Asefi and Gary back in 2003 looked at this idea about the belief of consuming alcohol leading to worse performance. So people always have this general idea of, well, if I consume lots of alcohol, then my memory performance will ultimately be worse. So ultimately, I'm going to have these decreases in my memory performance. And ultimately, what did we actually find here? We actually found the following results. So very interestingly, Asefi and Gary found the following. If we look at the figure on the left, we actually look at the number of items that were correctly recalled by individuals in each one of the conditions. So essentially what Asefi and Gary did was the following. They had two groups. They had a control group and they also had a misled group. Now in both instances, both groups were not actually given alcohol, but they wanted to view what would actually happen to memory performance just with the idea, the notion aside of just having alcohol consumption even being a part of the experimental situation. So you notice here that the white bars reflect when they were told that they were receiving alcohol. The black bars here are in reference to when they were told that they were receiving a tonic, so a non-alcoholic drink. So if you look in terms of the results of Asefi and Gary's research findings, they're very, very interesting findings associated with this idea of suggestibility with the idea of consuming alcohol. So just to kind of set up the scenario here for you in terms of what Asefi and Gary did, is they had individuals either drinking what they thought was going to be alcohol, or they were just drinking pure tonic water. Now, the alcohol here that they were consuming was supposed to be tonic water with vodka, versus the other group who was only receiving tonic water. So no alcohol, no vodka in their drink. Now, very interestingly, what Asefi and Gary did is they had these individuals viewing an event, so like a criminal event that was in a very experimental situation, so a controlled situation where they were reviewing a criminal act that was happening. Now, aside from just viewing that event, when the actual participants came in to report what it was that they had viewed during that situation, they were either in two different groups. They were either in a control group where they were just asked, okay, can you please tell us about the situation? Or they were given misleading information, which is why we have this section here that's called the misled. So for these individuals, they're actually given information that is wrong, that's leading them to different conclusions, and ultimately trying to see what the effect of their ability to recall information associated with when it was that they thought that they were drinking alcohol versus when they did not drink alcohol, or when they did not think that they were drinking alcohol. So what did Asefi and Gary find in this specific situation? Well, when individuals were in the control group, they were just asked to report information associated with the events that they actually had seen in the video of the criminal act occurring. Essentially here we found no differences between the individuals who were told that they were receiving alcohol or the individuals that they were receiving tonic water. So here it didn't really seem that having this idea that they were consuming alcohol affected their ability to recall information associated with the event. Now, when they were in the misled group, very interestingly here, we find these huge differences between individuals who were in the tonic water condition and people who were told that they were receiving alcohol in that specific condition. So ultimately, what is it that we find in this specific situation? We find that if individuals are told that they are receiving alcohol and they are given misleading information, their memory responses or their ability to recall information associated with an event is much lower than if they're only told that they're receiving tonic water in this specific situation. Now, why may this potentially occur? Well, the individuals may potentially feel, the ones who were told that they were receiving alcohol, that since they did consume alcohol, it's potentially likely that they may be misremembering the information that was given to them. Because again, they were receiving alcohol. What's the belief? you consume alcohol, you're ultimately going to have worse memory performance. Now, if we look on the graph that's on the right-hand side, we see the confidence ratings associated with their ability to recall information. Very interestingly here, both groups, the people who are in the control group versus the people who are in the misled group, in both situations, the people who were told that they were receiving alcohol, even though we had this idea that when you consume alcohol, your memory performance should be lower, in both situations, they felt that their ability to recall information should be high. Very, very interesting results. And this actually corresponds to a lot of the behaviors that we actually have whenever it is that we consume alcohol. So why is it that people drunk drive? Because they feel that, hey, you know what? I consumed a little bit of alcohol, but I'm still okay. I'm still a really good driver. I should be just fine. Or you even have those individuals who say, when I drink alcohol, I actually become a better driver. And that is not true. So we actually do see that whenever it is that you consume alcohol, your memory ability does decrease because you are having inhibition of your memory abilities associated with those events because of the effects of consuming alcohol. So we do really see those effects in the real world, right? The more alcohol you consume, the worse your memory will be. But just giving you that idea, that suggestion that you're consuming alcohol thus decreases your ability to correctly recall information because you then blame the alcohol as having been the cause of you not remembering that information correctly, thus you agreeing that, hey, you know what? Yes, that information it is that you provided with me, even that you provided to me, even though it is misleading, is actually accurate. So here we see very, very interesting results. And the starking, very impressive results here that we find is this idea of confidence. That even though people are consuming alcohol, or they're told that they're consuming alcohol, they still feel that they should perform very, very well in terms of their memory abilities, that they say, hey, you know what, I correctly recall that information. So even though they're in the misleading group, they still identify or assume here that they are actually recalling the information correctly. Very, very interesting results that we find here. So next, we have to look at this idea and continue thinking about this idea of confidence, because even though we have this group of individuals that, all right, well, they were told that they were drinking alcohol or they were drinking tonic water associated with their confidence and their ability to recall information. Well, what happens in general cases where we don't even provide suggestion that they're consuming alcohol or a drug, but we just ask people's confidence associated with their memory ability? One of the things that we find is that generally people tend to assume that they have very good memory abilities. It's very rare that you find somebody who says, oh, I just have a terrible, terrible memory. I never remember anything. We all know those people who kind of say that, right? That they say, oh, my memory is just awful. But then you question something that they're telling you, and all of a sudden now their memory ability seems to be 100%, that they're like, no, I remember that perfectly. So even though they gave these general ideas of, oh yeah, I don't have good memory skills, I don't learn information very well. Once you question their memory ability, or you question a memory that they're recalling, now all of a sudden everybody becomes, an expert at recalling information, and no one's memory is wrong. Everyone's confidence is through the roof. And one of the things that we find here is that confidence is not a good predictor of memory performance. We continuously see this idea of this negative relationship between the two. So in other words, the higher your confidence levels are, the lower your memory ability tends to be. So in other words, what ends up happening? It ends up happening that even though you may think that your memory is 100%, or that you are very good at remembering all the information that's out there, you generally don't tend to remember all the information that's out there. Why? Because you may be suffering from interference, you may be suffering from amnesia, a variety of reasons of why that may potentially happen. But ultimately here, we should never depend ourselves 100% on this idea of, well, the person said that they were 100% confident that they recall the information correctly, thus we should be okay. This is why we see in eyewitness testimonies so many problems when it comes across this issue associated with identifying individuals. Many, many times during the legal process, when we do have an eyewitness in the courtroom, they'll say, I'm 100% confident. When you tell somebody else, I'm 100% confident, you tend to have this belief of, man, well, that person is very, very confident. They're 100% confident. I'm not going to question anything about them. They're 100%. That's the person that they saw. When in reality, there's so many factors that may be contributing to their ability to actually identify individuals correctly. So that's why we shouldn't go with this idea of, well, the person is confident, or even I'm confident of my own abilities. One of the things that you should be certain of is giving yourself the test to see if you even have that memory. If you don't have that memory, continue to try to encode, study information, so that way you're able to better code the information whenever you put it into long-term memory, and you create effective retrieval strategies so that way you're able to get that information out. So again, we find that if people have low confidence, people have low performance. People have high confidence, people still have low performance. So very, very interesting results here that we find generally in terms of confidence as a predictor. So what are some general properties associated with metamemory? Well, the very first thing that we have to think about here associated with metamemory is this idea of the cue versus the target. So what can we use in my environment or in the situation that I'm currently in to be able to provide me with information associated with what it is that I need to retrieve? So one of the things that we can potentially do to kind of help us a little bit in terms of retrieving information is using cues that are familiar to us. Don't use cues, and remember, cues are things that occur in your environment, such as music, such as an object that you're looking at, such as a smell, that may potentially then be able to create or retrieve that information so that way you can use it later on. So if we use this idea of the cue familiarity hypothesis, ultimately here what we find is that if we have a familiar cue that we encounter pretty frequently, there's a higher probability to agreeing that the information is actually in our memory. So here, if we have something that occurs in our environment that we continuously are exposed to, we're much more than likely going to assume here then that information is actually present in our memory, because we continuously see objects that are very, very similar to that object or to that idea that we potentially have in our memory. And also using objects in our world as cues to identify information in our memory is going to be very, very effective. So if you're trying to learn, for instance, I don't know, let's say the equation of E equals mc squared, and you have a poster of Albert Einstein in your bedroom, and you continuously look at the poster while you're studying that specific formula and thinking about what that formula is all about and the theory behind it. If you continuously look at the poster, whenever it is that you see that poster, you're more than likely going to be then also retrieving the information associated with that equation in that specific instance. Now, we also have what's called the accessibility hypothesis, that although not all information may be retrieved, you can make inference that the memory is present. So even though you're able to get bits and pieces of information out associated with that memory, you're still going to probably say that you have the memory there, even though it's an incomplete memory or you don't remember every single aspect associated with it. So this is why when people are telling you a story and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that. Yeah, absolutely. I don't remember about it, but yeah, I kind of remember that situation or what potentially happened in that specific instance, but yet I don't remember all the details. That's ultimately what that means, that I'm having trouble accessing everything, but yet I'm able to access bits and pieces, and ultimately I'm going to probably assume here that I actually do have that memory present in my memory store. And last issue here that we'll talk about associated with metamemory in terms of cues versus targets is this idea of the competition hypothesis. The competition hypothesis assumes that the amount of information being activated may hinder retrieval of information. So depending on how much information you're actually trying to actually activate, that may potentially be a problem, because now you have more things competing for activation. So if you guys remember from our discussion from our previous lecture in long-term memory, that we talked about the idea of spreading activation networks, that one node activates another node, that activates another node, and so on and so forth. The more nodes that you activate, the more competition that we're potentially going to have in terms of the retrieval of information. So even going back to our example or our participation point that we had earlier in the semester associated with this idea of the primacy and recency effect, that I gave you all the list of words of, bed, rest, awake, and so on and so forth. What's happening in that specific situation? Well, one of the key target words that's being activated is sleep, even though sleep did not actually occur in the list. And even though sleep did not occur in the list, we actually have that item becoming activated, and it's competing for retrieval. So even though it was not present in the list, it's still becoming activated, and all these other nodes are pointing towards it and saying, hey, sleep should potentially be here as well. It was not there, we really don't even know that, but it may potentially be there. So thus, even though it was not there, since it's becoming activated by all these other terms that are similar to it or associated with that potential category of sleep, now all of a sudden it's going to become active in that instance, and it's going to be then retrieved, even though it may be an incorrect item to be retrieved. And that also demonstrated to us that participation point also demonstrated to us the idea of confidence, that many individuals report their confidence associated with each of the items that they're trying to recall, and people are highly confident that they saw sleep, even though sleep never occurred in the list that we were using in that particular instance. Now, another key issue here that we think of in terms of meta memory is the idea of what we call prospective memory. Now, prospective memory is a very modern idea associated, well, the whole idea of meta memory, to be honest with you, and metacognition is much more modern in terms of psychological research in cognition, but the idea of prospective memory is even a newer kind of idea that we have within metacognition and meta memory. Now, the idea of prospective memory is remembering to do things for the future, so thinking about the future. A lot of times people say, never live in the past, always live in the future. Don't think about the past, think about the present, don't worry about the future. But in reality, we sometimes do need to think about the future, especially when we have to do things in the future. And to be honest, even looking into our past is good, because we actually do look into our past quite a bit. Because if you remember in the 4 steps associated with the perceptual process, step number 3 is looking back into our memory and looking at our previous experiences. That's ultimately looking into the past. So we typically do that all the time, but yet people always say that, right? So don't worry, the past has already occurred. Don't worry about that. Live in the present. Don't worry about the future. Well, here we also had to think about the future, and many instances we have to think about the things that we have to do in the future, especially for us in academics, right? That we have homework assignments to do, that we have an exam to study for, that you have an activity to go to, etc., etc., etc. So it starts becoming a more complicated aspect associated with the world that we live in, now having to think about the things that I have to do in the future. So how do we actually do perspective memory, or how do we actually work with perspective memory? We have to monitor our own memory ability. So in other words, again, going back to this idea of meta memory, being aware of your own memory so that way later on you can take action. So in other words, saying to yourself, hey, I can't forget that I have to go to the bank and give this payment. I can't forget to do that. I can't forget to go to the bank and give this payment. And even as an hour passes, something may cue that up, and somebody may say, oh yeah, Bank of America. And you say, oh man, Bank of America, I gotta go to the bank. I can't forget to go to the bank. Okay, so I know that I have to go to the bank. I've already told myself 10 times I'm gonna go to the bank. So here, thinking about that's going to be a very effective way for us to be able to then do things in the future. So actually take action, right? So us actually being able to recall and taking action to being able to do that process later on. But then the big question is here, is this an easy task? Is it easy to monitor my own memory? And I don't know. I really can't give you that answer, because for different individuals, it's different responses. So for some individuals, they say, yeah, it's a very, very easy task. I tend to remember a lot about other things that I have to do in the future. But then also think about it. Well, what happens if you have too much information? So again, going back to this issue of the competition hypothesis, what happens when you have too many things to do or too many things to remember? Is it possible then that we may potentially forget something out of all the things that we're trying to do because we're remembering too many things? And the answer is yes, also, right? I still remember the day where I had to learn the task of doing a to-do list. It was the saddest day in my life, because I thought to myself, oh no, like what's happening to my memory? Why do I now have to make a to-do list? But the answer is, it's a very effective strategy to being able to remember information for a later point in time. So using post-it notes, using a to-do list are going to be very effective strategies to help you be able to do things in the future without having to rely 100% on your own ability to recall information. Because again, this points us back to the issue of confidence. You say to yourself, okay, I'm not going to forget to go to the bank. Okay, I'm 100% sure I'm going to remember it. What's assurance reflect, or what's it associated with or synonymous with? Confidence, right? So in other words, I'm 100% confident that I'm going to remember to go to the bank. Now, how many days in a row have you forgotten to go to the bank or to do the homework assignment? And now at the last minute, you're running around because that's the last thing on your list, and you remember, and you're like, what am I forgetting? What am I forgetting? Oh no, I totally forgot to do the homework assignment or go to the bank. Now I got to rush and do it. And now your performance is probably going to be lower, and you're going to have lots of errors because you're trying to perform the task too quickly. So ultimately, in summary, associated with meta memory here, what is meta memory? Again, just being aware of your own memories, being aware of your own abilities to retrieve information. And this is going to be very, very important for you to be able to recognize things out in your environment, use them as cues to be able to retrieve information, and we're going to want to try to retrieve information as effectively as possible. So being aware of your own ability to create and encode memories is going to be fundamental for you to be able to then store the information appropriately and then try to retrieve it later on. And last, an individual's confidence is not a good predictor of your memory capacity or your knowledge. So here we should never base ourselves off of just individuals saying, I'm 100% sure that this is the case. We always want to see the evidence associated with it, their discussion of the memory, their action associated with the retrieval of that information, or whatever the case may be. All right, so now let's change our discussion here to talking about how to actually improve your memory abilities. And more than likely, this has probably been a section of the class that you've probably been waiting for, right? That you're telling yourself, all right, now he's going to tell me how to best remember information. Why don't we talk about this stuff at the beginning of the semester? And the answer is the following. Enhancing your memory is actually a very difficult thing to do, and it's not that that's simple for us to say just do these things and it's going to help improve your memory, because that's not always the case. But rather, what do we find? Well, we find that in many situations certain techniques work for certain individuals, and there's not one specific technique that's going to be the most effective in helping you encode information and then retrieving it at a later point in time. So ultimately, we have to then look at all these different techniques and say to ourselves, what best works for me? It's really an evaluation process, and we had to go through the entire part of short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory to really get to this point about how to enhance our memories. Because again, it's not as easy as it sounds to be able to do these kinds of things. All right, so let's go ahead and shift our attention to trying to enhance our memory. Using different mnemonic techniques or different memory techniques are very important in many instances, because one of the things that we need to think about is that we want to try to increase the likelihood or the success of information getting from short-term memory into long-term memory. So for the last couple of weeks, we've continued to be talking about this particular issue, and that we say, hey, you know what, information is out there in the world, I'm trying to learn that information, and I want to be able to bring that information in. So the question then is, how do I efficiently and effectively do this? Because if there are techniques or different strategies that I can potentially use that might actually lead to the success of me being able to acquire information, why don't I just actually implement those techniques? Well, that is easier said than done, to be honest with you. Because one of the big things that we have to consider is every single technique efficient or effective for all types of material? And also, do you have time to be able to implement these kinds of techniques? And these are two major questions that we're going to try to explore for the remainder of this lecture. So when we think about memory devices or these memory techniques, what's their purpose? Their purpose is really to help us improve our memory, to encode information, to help us keep information in our long-term memory readily accessible to us. Because remember, once information is in long-term memory, we assume it's there forever. But in certain instances, the information might get shifted around, it might get displaced, it may be moved to another area where you may not have easy access to it, or you just infrequently use it, so the associations that you've previously made become very, very weak, so it's much more difficult to get that information out. So in many cases, we use these different types of techniques or these different types of memory devices so that way we can actually help ourselves to be able to get the information coded correctly, keep the information readily available for ourselves in terms of our memory, and then also we actually want to try to get the information out of long-term memory. So certain types of techniques are very, very efficient in terms of getting the information out. So it's not just about getting the information in like we've talked about in the past, but also how do we get that information out? And that's a major issue that we're going to try to tackle in terms of some of our ideas associated with these different types of techniques. So one of the things that we have to consider about using memory devices is that we actually use memory devices pretty much every single day in our life. We just don't really notice that we use different types of memory devices. We assume that we just have really good memory, or that we just know of these amazing strategies that no one else knows about or that I've developed, and ultimately that's why I'm so good at this. But in reality, we have actually been using memory devices and memory techniques pretty much every single day of our lives. And they seem to be pretty efficient because they actually do help us remember a lot of the information. Yet in certain instances, they really don't help us because they may be accessing the wrong information, or they may just be ineffective in creating the retrieval that we actually need. Or the retention of the information may also be faulty. So we need to be able to monitor the success of all our techniques in our devices to make sure that they work appropriately. And the idea behind memory devices are really that they provide us with a framework with how we learn information. Because this is really the way that when we try to study, we actually try to implement different types of techniques so that way we can efficiently study and get the most out of our study time. Now, one thing to do keep in mind here is that some of the techniques that we're going to be talking about are much more difficult than others. So while you're reading these and going through the lecture, one of the things that you're going to notice is you're going to say, man, that sounds really time consuming, or that just doesn't sound like if it would work. And to be honest, not all techniques work for everybody. And not all techniques are actually going to be very useful in terms of time. Some of these techniques take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and they really require a lot of our attentional resources for them to be successful. So we have to keep in mind that whenever it is that we're thinking about using these different types of techniques, we have to keep in mind, do we have the time associated with trying to learn that information through this technique? If not, I need to change my technique around, and I need to learn that information much more efficiently and effectively through other techniques. Now, just to keep our ideas associated with mnemonics, we've already actually talked about mnemonics quite a bit throughout the semester. Our first encounter associated with mnemonics was this idea of George Miller's 7 plus or minus 2, that we talked about this idea of chunking, or that we create these mnemonic devices, such as having, just the acronyms being created associated with specific institutions. So for instance, for us that we say OLU, that you say OLLU, so for Our Lady of the Lake University, or that you say FBI for Federal Bureau of Investigation, CIA, and all these other different types of acronyms that we actually have out there. Acronyms in themselves actually function as a mnemonic technique, because the purpose of this mnemonic technique, of the acronym itself, is to help us remember the information that it actually relates to. So if you only know FBI, but you don't know what FBI stands for, this technique failed to do what it was supposed to do. Because the technique in itself was supposed to help you simplify the larger information of Federal Bureau of Investigation or Central Intelligence Agency or National Security Agency or whatever the case may be, trimming that down to having an acronym such as FBI, CIA, or NSA. But rather now, if you just say FBI, but you actually don't know what it refers to, now we potentially have a problem because the information that we need to expand on is not really going to be present. Some other very famous techniques here that you may have actually encountered in your life at some point. This one was brought up to me a number of years ago by a student who said, oh yeah, this is the way that we learned how to actually remember the days of the number of days in each month. So essentially with your knuckles, what you would do is the knuckle bump equal 31 days for the month, and the knuckle gaps equal 30 days except for February, which has 29 or 28. So you'll notice now that as we try to use these techniques and we actually try to integrate the information that we're trying to acquire into something that we can actually feasibly use, you'll notice that a lot of exceptions tend to come up. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about quite a bit with the information that we're trying to learn, that we're going to say, even though, this technique does help us learn, there's sometimes exceptions to the technique in terms of what it is that you can actually learn. So they're not all effective in terms of the way that we can actually process information and try to encode it, and then also be able to retain it and retrieve it for later on. So now let's think of some types of mnemonic strategies or mnemonic systems that actually exist out there. The more famous ones that we actually come across are very verbal in their nature, to be honest. We call these verbal mnemonics. And what are some of the verbal mnemonics that we have? General, what we call rote rehearsal, or you'll hear it being called repetition or just rehearsal in general, but it's also called rote rehearsal, R-O-U-T-E rehearsal, which ultimately means that you just continue to repeat the information over and over again until you finally acquire the information successfully. This is a very efficient strategy if you actually want to think about it in that case. We tend to use this a lot during our daily lives. This is the one that we normally tend to depend on quite a bit. When we think about working memory, for instance, when we talked about the phonological loop, that we had a lot of repetition or this aspect of rehearsal, it was in reference to this idea that you're trying to learn information by just repeating the information over and over and over again, and hopefully that will help you learn the information. And most of the time it's very successful to being able to do that. But to be honest, when we think about the more meaningful connections associated with the information, that may be lacking there. So you may know the words to a story, but if you don't know what the meaning behind the story is, you kind of miss the point. Because, well, granted, you know all the words to the story, but if you don't know what it actually means, your message is going to be completely different, or you're not going to be able to transmit that information successfully to other people. We can also use what's called the coding method. With the coding method, we use words to encode very large numbers or very large amounts of numbers in certain instances. So here, for instance, you might want to think of the following, that we're going to transform a number into a word so that way it makes it easier for people to remember. For instance, many of you are going to say to yourself, 1-800-CALL-ATT, I've never heard of that. Well, you know what, when I was growing up and you needed to make a long distance phone call, and we didn't have cell phones around, you normally went to a payphone and you made a long distance call by dialing a 1-800 number so that way you could be able to get connected with an operator through this service, and they would be able to communicate you with a long distance individual or international individual as well. So I remember using 1-800-CALL-ATT all the time. Now tell me what call ATT is in terms of its numbers, and I have no idea. But if you look at a phone or you look at a payphone or even a rotary phone, you'll notice that there are letters underneath those numbers. And the whole idea behind that was that was their entire purpose. That you would be able to say, it's 1-800-CALL-ATT. You knew that every 1-800 number started with 1-800, so you didn't really have to even think about that. You just said call ATT. So you would stand in front of the payphone and you would dial a 2, and so on and so forth until finally you got call ATT, and AT&T would answer, and they would be able to communicate you with whoever it was that you were wanting to speak with. Now, one of the reasons that using this coding method is so effective is that words are actually a lot easier to remember than numbers, to be honest with you, especially very long strings of numbers. So here, the idea behind the coding method was that if you make this association between a word and a number, that would make it much more effective for you to be able to remember that information. So for instance, if you wanted to remember a string of letters, for instance, that had 5 digits, one of the things that you could do is you could use a word like 5, right? So you would say 5, so that way you remember that it had 5 digits, right? That would be one of the easier things to do. But for instance, a person might use 4 to remember 4 digits. Why? Well, because 4 had double representation. So it had 4, already the number, within itself, right, within the word, but then also it had 4 letters. So the 4 letters could then represent the 4 numbers that you were wanting to work with in that particular instance. So it's a lot easier for us to actually recall those words rather than the numbers, and it's going to be much more efficient for us to be able to do that rather than trying to learn every single number that's in there, because remember, going back to this idea a 7 plus or minus 2, you only have space for 5 to 7 digits, right? Or 5 to 9 digits, to be honest with you, because 7 plus or minus 2. But yet here, if you're able to associate that with a word, the word is going to be much more effective. So rather than trying to remember what call represented in terms of numbers, you just said call, and then you looked on the sheet or you looked on the keypad and were able to dial the specific numbers. Because to be honest, I tried memorizing what the number was many, many years ago, and I still don't know. But whenever I hear AT&T, I'm always like 1-800-CALL-ATT, because that was the way that we dial long distance numbers. Now, when we look more closely at verbal mnemonics, there's lots of different ones that we continue to encounter. We also have one that's called the first letter mnemonic. The first letter mnemonic is actually a very widely used mnemonic device that we actually have. And again, this goes back to the ideas of using acronyms. So we're going to be taking the first letter of each word so that way we can then create the mnemonic device that's associated with that specific long list of words. So for instance, MAD, M-A-D-D, was Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. FBI, that we had, that was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, CIA, and so on and so forth. But to be honest, one of the things that we have to consider is that there is this difference in terms of first letter mnemonics and what we have what are called acronyms, and then what we also have that are called acrostics. Acrostics are a very special kind of first letter mnemonics in the sense that these acrostics are letters that are used to make a meaningful sentence. So for instance, EGBDF, every good boy deserves fruit. Or for instance, in statistics that we use the acrostic NOR, which is black in French, and we say it's nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio data. So in other words, what's the purpose of us actually using these types of devices? We're trying to simplify larger pieces of information. In this particular case, mothers against drunk drivers, every good boy deserves fruit, nominal, ordinal, interval, ratio. And we're trimming the information down so that way it becomes a little bit closer for us to be able to understand. And here I've also given you two pictures associated with how we actually have this idea behind acronyms and also acrostics. Acrostics, you probably more frequently use them, especially now with texting, very, very frequently, LOL, rolling on the floor laughing, or whatever ones it is that are out there. The one that we have here, WTF, a lot of people use that one whenever it is that they text. So people actually end up resorting a lot to acrostics because they represent some type of meaningful sentence here that we're going to be using in that particular case. Now, again, the idea behind this first letter mnemonics and one of their benefits is that they're very effective for keeping the order of the items. So in reality here, one of the great things about this is that if you actually care about the order of these specific words, using these types of acronyms and also acrostics are going to be very, very effective for doing that. So doing something like MAD or NORI here that we have, both of those are not going to allow themselves to change the way that you're going to transmit that information to others. So in other words, in the way that you're going to retrieve that information. So when you see MAD, you're not going to say drivers against mothers drunk. You're not going to say that. And actually that would be a weird one, right? That if we said that drivers against, drunk mothers, that would be weird. But here in this particular case, you would never think that MAD would represent that. Rather, you would say it's mothers against drunk drivers because that's supposedly the specific order associated with that acronym or even the acrostic in that specific instance. Now, in terms of other strategies that we encounter as well, we have what's called the story method mnemonic. The story method essentially is a very effective learning strategy that a lot of people actually implement. The items are linked together in the story, so the target items, they're all occurring within a story, and the story is supposed to lead you down the path of being able to integrate the target items into the story so that way when you're talking about the story, you're going to be able to remember that information effectively here. Now, ultimately here, the order of the story also is going to help you keep the order of the items that you're interested in looking for. Now, what are some examples of the story method? Many of you have probably used some of these in the past. So here, let's look at these very quickly. Something like the following. You may actually want to remember the list of countries or counties in the south of England. Sorry, not countries in the south of England, but the counties of the south of England. So here they're Avon, Dorset, Somerset, Cornwall, Wiltshire, Devon, Gloucestershire, Hampshire, and Surrey. So these are our specific counties that we have. So rather than trying to use rote rehearsal to learn all of these terms, which seems like an effective strategy, right? That if I just keep repeating them, sooner or later I should be able to remember them all effectively. If I create now a story that goes along with this idea, it should ultimately lead me to identifying all the specific target words that I have in my particular story. So now let's look at the way that we actually put this together in a story itself. So an Avon lady is walking up a path towards a strange house. She is hot and sweating slightly in the heat of high summer. Beside the path, someone has planted giant corn in a wall, but it's beginning to wilt in the heat. She knocks on the door, which is opened by the devil. In the background, she can see a kitchen in which a servant is smearing honey on a ham, making it glossy, and gleam in bright sunlight streaming in through a window. Panicked by seeing the devil, the Avon lady screams, "Sorry," and dashes back down the path. Now here, if you look at this particular story, you're saying to yourself, okay, I have no idea what's happening in this story, but to a person who actually creates this particular strategy and uses this particular story and uses the key words or the target words in this particular case to be able to be integrated into the story, it's an effective strategy for them. So as they're going through the story, even though they're not using the specific names of the counties except for some. So in the case of Avon, for instance, right, that they're using it here, but in reality, that's the only target word that actually exists within the whole story, but everything else is something that's similar to the target word. So again, going back to this idea of having spreading activation, when you get to high summer, summer should activate then Somerset because they sound very similar. And we also find that in terms of these semantic networks that we have in terms of spreading activation, even words that sound similar to each other are going to then become active. So here we would assume then that that idea of summer would then help them identify Somerset. Beside the path, someone has planted giant corn in a wall. Here, now together, putting those words is supposed to identify for them that it's Cornwall as another county. Now here you'll notice that for this strategy to be effective, when the person is creating the story has to make some kind of sense, not the best sense to be honest with you, because this is not exactly the best sense that's out there, but at least it's some aspect associated with comprehension, right? That there's something there that you're like, okay, I can kind of see the meaning behind that. Not really, but it's there. But for the person who created this, for them it's a meaningful story. They can imagine this woman walking down the path towards the strange house. It's hot, she's sweating slightly in the heat of summer. When are you going to be sweating? You're not going to be sweating during the winter unless it's something, right, that's happening there. But ultimately here we would expect that they're not sweating too much and that it's not hot during the summer either. Beside the path, someone has planted giant corn. That seems like a feasible thing. In a wall, that's a little bit odd, so maybe next to a wall. That may be much more effective, but it's beginning to wilt. That wilt aspect referring then to Wiltshire in the heat. She knocks on the door, the aspect of Dorset, which is opened by the devil, and the county of Devon in that specific instance. So we see here that for this person, number one, the order might have been important, and number two, also, the idea behind using this type of strategy is that if you have time to do it, it's going to work. But what if you don't have time? So for the person who implements this story, for them, it probably took them a good couple of hours to come up with the story, number one, and then aside from that, then trying to memorize the story as well. So now you're not just learning the list of words anymore, which actually might have been much more effective and easier in terms of time because it may have only taken you 30 or 40 minutes to learn the list of counties, but now you have to memorize this story. So what happens in the case where you forget an Avon lady? What if you say an Avon dog and you're like, what? Like, how is that? Like, you forgot that it was a lady, but something else comes up to mind saying that it's this this thing that's now walking up a path towards a strange house. So what happens if you miss key information because you failed to retrieve the information associated with the story? So now, unfortunately, the story method fails for you. So here we see that using different types of strategies is not always the best, because if you don't have time or it becomes too much of a cumbersome task, cognitively speaking, it's going to begin to be very, very difficult for you to implement the strategy itself. Now, we also see what's called the major system. The major system is also called Harrigan's mnemonic system. And ultimately, this is a way that we actually try to remember numbers specifically. And here, ultimately, rather than the coding method where you have words representing numbers, you have individual letters that represent numbers. So very similar to the coding method, but now, ultimately, you only have one letter that represents a number. So for you, you're going to use something like B or P to represent a 9 because they look something similar like a 9 potentially, or a Z equals a 0. And what you do is you create your own word using this strategy. So you pair up numbers with letters, and then when you want to memorize that specific string of numbers that's going to be very long, rather than imagining the numbers, you're representing now the letters in this particular case. And you may make up words, you may make up pieces of words, or whatever the case may be, and that's going to seem as an effective strategy for you. So again, now if you're looking at that and you're saying to yourself, yeah, that doesn't seem to work very well. So what if you just make up a whole bunch of meaningless pairs of letters together to represent numbers? And that may actually happen. And you have to be careful with that because now you have to try to remember a B and a Z. So what if it's 90210 and you remember a B with a 9 because that's the way the pair was supposed to happen, and a Z with a 0, and you're like BZ? Like, that's weird. Like, what's BZ? So here in that particular case, it may be a little bit of an odd strategy to use, but yet people do use those. Now here we've looked at this aspect of using verbal mnemonics a lot. So relying here on the verbal components associated with our cognitive abilities to be able to then recall information that we're trying to learn. So we're associating a lot of verbal content with the information that's the target, but can we use other strategies other than verbal mnemonics to be able to actually remember information that we want to learn? And the answer is yes. Rather than specifying just verbal content, one of the things that we can now rely on is the imagery components associated with our cognitive skills. So rather than us saying, okay, I'm going to use this list of words to be able to remember other targets that I'm interested in, such as with the coding method, or with the major system, or with any of the ones that we've just currently or previously talked about, now what you're going to do is you're going to use mental imagery to be able to help you remember information later on. So when we think of this idea of imagery mnemonics, we think a lot about strategies associated with trying to remember lists. That's always a big thing for us in cognitive psychology, that we want people to try to learn lists. And when you think about why we would want you to learn lists, well, really out there in the real world, you tend to learn lots of lists, or you try to remember lots of lists as well. Think about when you go to the grocery store that you're going through your pantry and you say to yourself, oh yeah, I need cereal, I need sugar, I need pancake mix, I need oil, etc., etc., etc. Well, you're trying to then remember a list later on. So are there ways for you to be able to successfully retrieve the list of things that you need later on at the grocery store without having to write it down, or relying on some other type of verbal strategy like the story method? Imagine trying to learn, create a story associated with your grocery list that's going to take you a couple of hours to learn. Well, it just might have been more effective to actually just write this information down, right? I mean, that may be one of the cases. So can we actually use a strategy like mental imagery to actually help us be able to remember that information later on? And the answer is definitely yes. One of the ways that we do this is what we call the link method. With the link method, essentially, you're going to make associations between an item and a vivid image containing that specific item. The next item is going to be a continuation of the previous item, and we make sure the item is central to the part of our image that we're trying to create here. So for instance, one of the things that you may need is you may need carrots, and this is what you imagine for yourself. You imagine your kitchen and you imagine carrots on your countertop with a knife. So here, when you're thinking about you needing carrots, this is the image that you associate carrots with, so that way when you're at the grocery store later on, and you're like, what is it that I need? You can think of your kitchen, and the kitchen then should help you activate that association between the kitchen and needing carrots that are out on the cutting table there for you to be able to purchase at a later point in time. Now, ultimately here, let's say that we need a carrot and we also need a bell pepper, as we see here in our image. So next to the carrot, we have bell peppers. So you think to yourself, okay, I remember seeing the carrot, and now what was next to the carrot? It was a bell pepper, right? I remember the red color. It has to be a bell pepper or a tomato or something of that sort, but it's not going to be something that's going to be out of the ordinary. That's something that's generally not red. So you're not going to say to yourself, I need bananas. Well, no, you need something that's red, and we look at the red fruit and we say here it's a tomato, or either a bell pepper in those particular cases, or a vegetable that we may need. So ultimately here, with this idea of the link method, we're going to try to create this real vivid image associated with us with the information that we actually need, with those specific items that are of interest for us. Now, other strategies that we may use are things like what we call the peg word or the peg and hook method. Now, very interesting kind of strategy that we have here, kind of odd in the way that I'm going to talk about it, because it's an odd strategy, to be honest with you. But the idea behind the peg word or the hook method is really this idea that we're going to imagine a set of hooks, and each hook represents the location and a name associated with the target that we want. So the image of an object on a hook should rhyme together, associated with the location and the name that we want here. So for instance, if you think about this key here that I have for you, or this key holder here that we have, right? So here you're going to place things on each one of the little hooks that we have there. And in the first one, you're going to say the first one is a 1, has to rhyme with this specific word. So in the first slot, the target word that we need was bun. So 1 and bun somewhat tend to rhyme. You're going to imagine a bun for a hamburger bun being placed on the first hook. Now you also need a shoe. Now you're going to place the shoe on the second hook. Shoe, 2. Okay, they seem to rhyme. 3, you also need to go buy a little tree that you wanted to plant outside. So you're going to imagine on the third hook, a little tree that's going to go on there. Now here in this particular case, pretty intensive in terms of the way that we have to do this, because what happens in the case where your target doesn't rhyme with a number, like in this particular case? Well, then it's going to become very difficult for you to actually implement this strategy. So here, it's important that bun rhymes with 1. So what if you don't need a bun and you only needed a shoe and a tree? So then what? There's no 1? So you just skip 1 in that particular case? And the answer is kind of, well, yeah, because you only use whatever it is that you need for that specific strategy. So if order is important, this one might not necessarily be that good for you, because again, the order of 1, 2, and 3 are going to be important, but they're not the target. The targets are the second one that rhymes with 1, 2, or 3. So in this particular case, bun, tree, bun, shoe, or tree. So what if you actually need to first go buy a shoe? Then you need to go buy a tree, and then last you're going to go to the grocery store and you're going to buy some buns for hamburgers. So here, if you actually needed to know the order of that information being given to you in, here, this strategy, unfortunately, is not going to be very good because, again, it's not rhyming with those specific target words. So 3 with 1 just doesn't seem to rhyme, but here you may have to rely more on just mental imagery, thinking to yourself, okay, I remember these hooks that were just kind of on the wall, and I remember what was actually placed on those specific hooks. So maybe ignoring the whole idea associated with the 1, 2, or 3, the rhyming component, and having to go back and relying on something like a link method strategy, that you imagine just the hooks being on the wall and you hanging different things, and that may potentially help you with the order in that specific instance. Now, our third strategy here that we're going to visit is what's called the method of loci. The method of loci is one of my favorite strategies. And one of the reasons that it's one of my favorite strategies is because it seems to actually be a very effective strategy in terms of helping you remember information. So with the method of loci, what is it that we need to do? Well, essentially here you're going to take a route. So here you're going to imagine yourself in a situation where you're going to be walking through a specific scenario, and depending on where it is that you're looking within your imaginary route that you've created, you're going to be identifying the location of specific items that you need to recall later on. So think of a grocery list. So when you're thinking about a grocery list, where should you be thinking about yourself in terms of your route? Well, you should be thinking about the kitchen or the pantry in that specific instance. So with the method of loci, one of the things that you could do is you could be walking around your house, walking through your kitchen, walking through the pantry, opening the fridge, opening the pantry, and looking at what it is that you have placed in specific areas of your home or of the pantry or of the refrigerator. So normally what we do is we tend to be very much creatures of habit, right? We always tend to put the milk in the same place. We always tend to put the bread in the same place, our cereal, etc., etc., etc. So one of the things that you will notice is that when someone moves something from your typical place where you always store your particular groceries, you may be very uncomfortable and you may put it back, right? That you say, no, my cereal will go right here. The milk goes on this shelf, and etc., etc. So one of the things that we would expect then is that since you tend to have that same habit over and over and over again, if you use your imagination, create this imagery of you going through your home, and now you're in the kitchen and you open up the fridge and you imagine yourself, okay, what should go on the top row of, or the top shelf of my refrigerator? And you say to yourself, okay, well, normally I put the milk here, I put orange juice here, etc., etc., etc. So as you're imagining yourself in your kitchen, opening the refrigerator, you should be able to say to yourself, okay, I remember then this morning I was looking in the refrigerator and I didn't see any milk where it was supposed to be. That must mean that I'm missing milk. So milk was there. You imagine that that's where the milk is supposed to be, and you remember to yourself, okay, I need milk in that specific instance. So here you didn't have time to write it down. You didn't have time to create a story about the grocery list like with the story method or anything like that. but rather here using your imagery of what you normally are accustomed to within your specific situation that you normally live in. That should be able to bring up the information later on and say, yes, that's what I normally goes there in that specific location. I remember that I was running low. I might as well go ahead and buy that. And then even when you get home and you may have forgotten something and you open up your fridge or you open up your pantry, as soon as you look in that spot, you're like, oh, I forgot to bring that. I forgot to bring the orange juice, or I forgot to buy bread. And even though I remember opening the pantry and looking in here to see what was there and noticing in the morning that I was running low on bread and I didn't buy it. Why? Potentially here, you may move your bread around from time to time in terms of different shelves in your pantry or whatever the case may be, or even you may just have forgotten in that specific instance to actually be able to get that information later on as you needed it. So here we see with the method of loci, one of the things that it's very effective in is that you really don't have to spend time trying to learn information, because we would expect then that for this information, all that you're doing is you're just traveling around this route, picking out specific locations and picking out specific objects that should naturally exist in your environment. Well, what happens if we don't have that object in that specific location? Well, then we might tend to have difficulty remembering that information later on whenever it is that we're trying to implement this technique. Now, another question that may arise is, well, what happens in the particular case where we are not trying to remember the grocery list, but something that we've been given, so a list of numbers or a list of words or whatever the case may be. In that particular case, the method of loci may not necessarily be as effective unless you are able to walk through a specific route and put those numbers up using your imagination in different locations. And as you're walking through, that specific route, you identify and you say, okay, I'm looking right here at this specific door, and I remember on that door, it was the second door because it represented the number 2, and so on and so forth. So you may be able to do that in that particular case. So now let's look here at one of our second to last imagery technique. Now this is what's called the keyword method. Keyword method, pretty much like all the other ones, seems to be a little bit more time consuming than what we would like. Because to be honest, we would really like things to be effective for us. We would like things to be fast, and that we learn the information quickly and effectively, and we're ready to go, and we're ready to recall that information whenever it is that we need it. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. Now, one of the things that we find associated with the keyword method is that the keyword method is very good for actually learning foreign words for a foreign language class, for instance. So if you actually want to learn something like the word letter in Spanish, which is carta, right? So here you select your target word, which is carta, and you find its translation equivalent, which is letter in our specific language, right, in English. So now what you do is you find a similar native language word that sounds like the target word. So in this specific instance, the word cart, right? So cart sounds a lot like carta, right? It's got a lot of similarities. The only thing that's missing is an A here to actually say carta. Now here, cart is this word is going to function like a keyword. Now what we're going to do is now picture both interacting together, our keyword and the target word. So here in this particular case, we may visualize a letter being carried in a cart, such as what a mailman does. So here what you're going to do is you're like, okay, I need, what does carta mean? I don't remember what it means. And then you remember that mental image of, okay, I remember the carta sounds a lot like cart, or it's got similarities in terms of the way that it's spelled. Okay, I remember imagining a letter being put inside of a cart. It means letter. And that's the whole idea behind this specific technique. Now, one of the things that you're probably thinking to yourself is like, that's crazy and it sounds super, super time consuming. And the answer is, it is. It's a very, very time consuming technique, because one of the things that you have to do is that you have to find a translation equivalent in our specific language that sounds a lot like the target word, but isn't the target word. So it's very, very important to be able to use this strategy and find that specific keyword and then create the mental image. So aside from just knowing the keyword or finding the keyword, now you have to create the mental representation of them interacting together. And once you imagine them interacting together, then that should ultimately then be used whenever it is that you're in testing. Again, a very lengthy and difficult process to use, but it is actually quite effective whenever it is that people want to learn foreign language vocabulary specifically. Now, the last technique here that we're going to talk about is actually one that all of us have used. You just probably never realized that you use it. And we've actually talked about it already in previous lectures. The idea of context learning, or using contextual cues to be able to identify missing information. Now, the idea with context learning is that we're trying to learn information based on the cues that are given to us by the surrounding context, specifically other words that may be being provided to us to help us identify this information. Now, if we have a word that is standing alone, so it has no surrounding context, that may be a very, very difficult thing to then learn, because you may have to rely on something like rote rehearsal, because you only have the word and the translation and that's it. So here now, instead, one of the things that you may want to do is use the surrounding context to use the actual, or try to identify the meaning of the word. We do this quite often by using that surrounding information to help us make that connection for that missing information. This happens to us a lot whenever it is that we're reading. How many of you actually use contextual learning while you were reading these chapters this week? And the answer is a lot. That you run across a word and you're like, I don't know what that word means, but then you finish reading the sentence and you're like, okay, I think it means that. Or I'm going to play on the assumption that it means that. And you're good to go and you keep going. And here, ultimately, that's actually something that we tend to use quite frequently, quite often. We actually use context learning a lot, aside from just trying to learn information like the meaning of words or trying to recall information. So for instance, you may remember the entire sentence, but you're forgetting one key word. And using the context, you can actually predict or infer what that missing keyword is in that specific instance. Context learning is actually not that time consuming, especially if you've already been given the information. But if you haven't been given the information and you now have to create the context, that may be a little bit more difficult, especially if you don't know what the meaning of that word is. Now, what are some major limitations that we're going to find across all different mnemonic techniques, let that be verbal or let that be imagery based? Well, we have to think about the purpose of the procedure in itself. So we have to think about, for instance, time of presentation versus the effectiveness of that strategy. And to be honest, I don't know why it doesn't say effectiveness of the strategy. I don't think it came up on my slide. But here, the purpose of the procedure is the time of presentation versus the purpose or the effectiveness of that strategy in itself. So one of the things that we find is that if things take a lot of time for us to actually be able to learn, creating a mental image or creating this keyword, creating the story behind this list of words that we're trying to remember, man, it's going to be a very, very time-consuming task, and it's probably not going to be effective in helping us learn information, especially if we only have a short period of time to learn that information. What happens in the case where we have abstract material? If we have abstract material, mental imagery really doesn't help. So when you think of a word, for instance, like love, love is abstract in its nature. Now, when you think of love and you think to yourself, no, it's not. Like, I can picture what love is. No, you picture behaviors that you assume represent love. People kissing, people hugging, marriage, children, etc., etc., etc. All these different things are concrete ideas or concrete behaviors or objects that represent that general abstract idea of love. For instance, when we think of war, give me, ideas of what war is. Think of war. And when you think of wars, you imagine bombs going off, an atomic blast. You may think of people crying in the streets, buildings, broken down or whatever, or blown up, or whatever the case may be. But yet, those are concrete ideas that represent the abstract idea of war. So, if we think, for instance, of what the mental imagery is behind an abstract word, it's going to be very, very difficult to be able to do that. So ultimately here, what's going to happen in that specific case, we're going to end up having to take extra steps to be able to then think of the concrete idea to then say it's going to be associated with the abstract term and then remember the abstract term based on the concrete idea. So when you're thinking of, for instance, peace later on today, you're going to think of the concrete idea of, for instance, people shaking hands, or a little dove flying through the air, whatever the case may be, to then help you remember what peace represents in that specific instance. Furthermore, when we think of additional limitations that we encounter with using mnemonic techniques, we find that most actions actually revolve around verbalization. So the ability for us to actually create mental images is actually a very difficult process for us to do, because one of the things that we have to consider is that if we take time to find the perfect match to that ideal of whatever that object is, that can be actually very, very time consuming for us. So we find that with mental imagery, it begins to become very difficult for us because we have to spend a lot of our time also trying to find those ideals, in terms of our exemplars or in terms of that prototype that we're working with. Also, when we think about verbatim memory, mnemonic techniques don't generally actually have word-for-word memorization. So if you think about the way that, for instance, the story method actually functions, that we're designing this entire story, rote rehearsal is actually being used to actually learn the story in itself. So the key target words that we're actually trying to learn are intertwined into the story, so they're part of that story, but yet the story in itself was probably going to be learned through rote rehearsal and not through some other type of strategy. So when we think about order memorization, that becomes a very, very difficult task for us to use in terms of actually being able to come up with the information. And that's why in most cases, when we think about memory recall, a lot of tasks don't really require you to remember the specific order of the information, but rather as long as you have the information, that's good enough. Because having the sequence associated with that content is a very, very difficult task, and it's very challenging to be able to actually encode properly. Now, what happens in the case where we say to ourselves, well, okay, these mnemonic techniques don't really work out very effectively or efficiently. What else can we possibly do? Well, the good thing is that there's lots of external memory aids that we can actually use that actually take away some of the tediousness associated with using the mnemonic techniques. So we don't actually have to take up too much time or have to rely on coming up with a lot of imagery associated with the techniques, but rather we can allow other kinds of techniques or methods to be able to take the role of keeping that information in terms of our memory, if you want to think of it like that. Generally, the best way that we actually have for having external memory aids is really just to write down information. It's really the most basic aspect associated with trying to remember information, with writing it on post-it notes, having bookmarks, for instance, so that way you remember your place in a book, having a phone book so that way you can identify phone numbers. Now, granted, the phone books are a lot more outdated, but yet there's lots of different techniques that use the same idea. That's why you take notes also whenever it is that you're taking a class, so that way you just write down the information and helps you. That actually is going to help you remember some of the information later on when you're trying to study, rather than trying to think of all the things that I said during lecture. So here are the basic aspects associated with trying to have a good strategy to actually remember something. Write it on a post-it note, put it in a place where you look at very frequently on the way out of your house, or on your steering wheel, or in your wallet, or on your phone, somewhere where you're going to have easy access to and that you look at a lot, so that way you can remember that information because the post-it note will be there. One of the most simplest techniques that we actually use out there in terms of remembering information. We also use what's called the memory wallet. The memory wallet is a very interesting kind of idea, because one of the things that we find is that factual information is quite difficult to remember in terms of specific events. So for instance, remembering birthdays, remembering specific holidays. So we can actually use what's called the memory wallet to actually be able to remind us of those very general specific events, rather than specific details associated with events, but rather just having the general dates associated with events or the times. Think of the memory wallet as functioning like the function on your phone that's the calendar, and it gives you a little update that tells you, hey, this is happening today. Memory wallets are essentially the same thing. It just keeps track of all those important special dates. We can also use different types of electronic tools in terms of our memory aids. Our cell phones are very, very good at doing that for us. Back in the day, we used to have Palm Pilots. Palm Pilots were essentially the precursors to the notes and to the calendar app that we now have on our phone, and that would help people keep themselves organized. So you can really have different types of electronic organizers or different types of strategies that are electronic in their nature to really help you remember that you're supposed to be doing certain things, or even to take medications, for instance. Nowadays, the little medication bottles come with a specific timer that rings every time that you're supposed to take the medication. And that's actually very helpful for individuals who tend to have lots of memory loss or to have difficulty remembering if they've already taken their doses or not. Now, one of the interesting kind of topics that we kind of come across is this issue of drugs associated with memory enhancement. There's always lots of different drugs out there that people always say, like, oh yeah, if you take this specific type of medication or you take this drug, it's very much going to help you to increase your performance in terms of memory and really help you recall and retrieve information adequately or appropriately. And to be honest, I would really caution you in terms of the medications or drugs that are being sold in the general market in terms of memory enhancements. So one of the ones that you might actually see out there on the market is this one that's called DMAE H3 by TwinLab. And to be honest with you, when you read kind of the synopsis of what the medication is actually used for, and this is directly taken from an online resource associated with this medication, it's really just kind of a concentrated salt that actually comes in that we use in terms of some natural processes. But in reality, it's not really anything that's ever been demonstrated empirically to actually help or actually improve memory abilities or memory processes, to be honest with you. Yet their claim is that it actually hinders memory impairment, so your memory will improve, your learning is enhanced, your stamina is going to get improved, you're going to have weight loss, and then you're also going to have thermogenesis occur. So when you read all those things, so this one medication does all of these different things, seems very, very unlikely. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, we also used to have something that was called ginkgo biloba. And ginkgo biloba was also another kind of vitamin or supplement that individuals would take so that way they would have better cognitive performance overall, including memory. And again, neither of these have ever really been demonstrated empirically to help individuals improve their memory performance. But yet we find that the strategies that we've talked about here, the verbal and the imagery strategies, are actually much more effective in helping for memory performance and memory enhancement rather than taking drugs. So again, I tend to caution you if you've ever been told or you ever are told that there are medications that can help you with memory performance. It's actually a very unlikely thing that we actually find. If there was one actually out there, everybody would be taking it because we would all need improvements with our memory, believe me. So just kind of a quick summary here in terms of this week's lecture. Number one, memory mnemonics are very, very useful techniques or very useful devices that we actually have to help people organize, make associations, have meaningfulness associated with the content that we're discussing. Attention, again, is a very critical aspect to consider for each one of these techniques because, again, if you're not paying sufficient attention to the content, it's going to be very difficult for you to have successful, successful acquisition of the content that you're trying to learn in those specific instances. Do realize also that having different techniques are going to produce different results for different people. So not every single technique is going to work for every single person in the exact same way. So if one person says, oh, I use this learning strategy and it works really well to help me remember the information, yeah, that works for you, but that doesn't always work for everyone. People will always talk about, like, oh, studying with music or studying while watching TV or studying with this type of music versus that type of music and using these kinds of drugs versus that kind of drug or using this strategy versus that strategy. But yet, to be honest, it's really something that's so unique that you really need to find what strategy works the best for you and that you're willing to dedicate time and effort to being able to learn that content. So when we think about, memory as a whole, there are no real easy way out to learning information or using drugs to help you with memory enhancements. And to be honest, most of the times using these types of drugs are actually going to probably be much more dangerous to you rather than they are helpful. So here, be very, very cautious of that. So here, when we think about memory, what is it really about? It's really about hard work, and it's really about paying attention to the content, trying to make those meaningful connections, spending time working on trying to acquire that information, and thus that's going to lead to higher probabilities of you actually doing well on whatever task it is that you're intending to do. All right, so that wraps up our discussion for this week in terms of memory techniques and metacognition. I hope that you all enjoyed this lecture. This lecture was a little bit briefer than some of the other ones that we've covered this semester, but again, it's always a fun lecture to kind of talk about because we always think about our own memory abilities in these particular instances. All right, thank you guys very much for listening into this week's lecture, and stay tuned for next week's lecture.